What's the most messed up thing you've seen at work? Story 1. I once provided care for a man with dementia, which often led to him being paranoid. His brother, an ex-police officer, was stealing from him. He would pick up his pension but steal about 10 to 20% of it each time. When the gentleman I cared for called his brother out on it, his brother would always blame his dementia for his suspicions and then guilt trips him into apologizing for doubting him. Eventually, we were asked to collect his pension instead of his brother, after his brother refused to provide a full paper trail of his pension and to deliver the money in the sealed envelope it was given in at the office. His brother kicked off big time, trying to get us to stop providing care so he could keep exploiting him. We stood our ground, duty of care above all else, and our man got the pension he earned throughout his life in full. I saw lots of other messed up stuff in that job, but there's something about a man's older brother exploiting and emotionally gaslighting him which just hits hard. Elder abuse is terrible. I'm assuming the man was elderly. It's so hard for elders to get the real advocacy and protection they need because they're considered adults, unlike children who you can intervene on if you know something's wrong. That guy was lucky to have you in his corner. Yep, there's a reason why most phone scammers prey on the elderly. Story 2. I was a head lifeguard/lifeguard instructor. The worst was probably a 15-year-old boy who dove off the diving board, cracked his head open on the bottom of the pool, blood gushing, and was unconscious. My coworker and I had to do a deep water spinal rescue, which is basically the hardest rescue at a pool. The kid not only survived, but became a fellow lifeguard himself the next summer. Damn, he used that experience to help others. That's dedication. Story 3. A guy knew he was getting fired, so he took a crap in the trash can in his cubicle. Nobody knew if he did it there or took it to the bathroom to crap in it, but he did it one way or the other. He got called up to HR and was let go. Then the people working in his area started complaining about the crap smell and sure enough, found it in his little trash can. Then I called him to ask about it and he said it was an old burrito he forgot to throw out. It was not an old burrito he forgot to throw out. I was working the night shift at this one factory and this guy came in one night just messed up. On what, I'm not sure. Anyway, the supervisor eventually took notice and called the police to take him home. Well, I guess before he left, he went to the front office bathroom and took a massive crap, and then proceeded to just finger paint the walls with it. Crap everywhere. I guess he didn't plan on returning after that, but he left his phone, so he obviously had to come back and get it. Like, what a horribly embarrassing walk of shame. LMAO. We had a disgruntled worker smear crap all over the walls of a cubicle once. We had contracts in the wastewater industry though, and for some reason there were, several abnormal sewage incidents throughout that week. Another time, a disgruntled worker snuck in at night and set fire to the building I worked in, a temporary one-level building with about 5 office rooms and a larger open plan area. I never heard if either got caught, but it wasn't that bad of a company to work for, so in each case they could have figured out who fairly easily. I feel bad for the cleaning staff. Story 4. Coworker ended up ODing, and no one in his family told his dad. The only reason his dad found out his son died was because the dad called the company to see if his son still worked there. My boss had to be the one to tell him the bad news, because no one in the guy's family was willing to tell him. My grandma doesn't know about my cousin's death. He committed a double murder and was serving 2 life sentences and decided to hang himself. It's been over 2 years and everybody goes along with him still being alive. She's in her late 70s or early 80s and has Parkinson's. Everybody wants her to live out what she has left happily, but to me, it feels like we have a dirty family secret and I refuse to perpetuate it. So it's highs and goodbyes, so I'm not the bad guy in the family. Kind of the reverse of this, I heard this secondhand, but a guy's sister passed away, and someone called the place he worked and told the boss. The boss did not tell him until his shift was over because he had nobody to cover for him. The dude was obviously livid and went to upper management to complain later, which fired the boss. Still, how the hell do you become like that? That simply sounds tragic. Story 5. I saw a coworker get crushed to death under 6 tons of dirt. I helped dig his body out. God, thanks for reminding me of my construction days when I was 18. We were cutting out a trench for something. I'm thinking it was a water line of some sort and was fairly deep. it was just a muddy mess, and after about 5 days straight of rain, everything was waterlogged. We had just started the workday when we heard a ton of yelling further down the trench. Turns out, the shoring that was preventing the trench from collapsing had given out and buried a man inside up to his shoulders. Luckily, he survived, but wasn't in great state. Had broken most of his ribs and both his legs from the weight of the ground hitting him. The worst part was that while we were digging him out, just how serene he was. The guy had fully accepted that he was going to die. This was at Bethlehem Steel, Sparrows Point, Maryland. I was working at the pier at the time. Ships would come in carrying iron ore and other materials and be unloaded by tower cranes. The material would get loaded into hoppers and fed out onto conveyor belts. These belts would transport the material to where it was needed in the steelmaking process. The belts would spill ore and dirt constantly. At one point, inside a building, a belt toward the top of the building would spill down onto a slanted roof that was covering a motor on the ground floor. We would have to periodically get on this roof and clean the spillage. There was a huge chunk of dirt built up in the corner where the roof met a wall. My coworker was chopping away at this, breaking pieces off and sliding them down to fall off. The entire chunk broke away, hit him, and carried him off the roof. After hitting the ground, it broke apart and buried him. We got off the roof as quickly as possible and began shoveling him out. We carried his body to a bay door where paramedics were already arriving. I'll never forget what happened next. The paramedic started CPR on him. His hands sunk into his chest to the floor, and the chest rolled up around his hands. Everything inside was pulped. They pronounced him deceased then and there. Yeah, construction mishaps aren't for the faint of heart. Story 6. I used to work with special needs kids, ages 3 to 7, and one of them came up to me on a Monday morning and told me her dad died over the weekend, then skipped off to go play with the rest of the group. I learned later that day that he had overdosed on heroin, and I'm assuming she hadn't fully understood what being dead meant, and that she thought she might see him again. I have a severely disabled brother-in-law. The first time someone close to him died, he told them it's time to wake up at the funeral. He's old enough now to have realized these people never come back again, but I still don't think he understands fully. That's sad, but there's a sweet sense of innocence in the kid's words. Story 7. A guy lost a finger because he tried moving an industrial-strength fan without turning it off first, and his finger slipped through the grate. Thankfully, I didn't see it, but I worked with a guy who got part of his finger taken off by an industrial mill. People were supposed to turn it off before cleaning it, but, well, we're talking about a company that didn't even have a safety shower or eye wash stations in the lab, and safety protocols were not generally followed. Seriously, I don't know how more people didn't get injured at that place. It's a matter of time. They sent him to the lab area I worked in while his nubbin healed enough for him to go back to manual labor. I worked in a manufacturing environment with heavy equipment, lots of cutting tools, forklifts, and chemicals. We had a shipping dock and a lot of antique production machines from the 1960s. I suggested we have a company-wide meeting with every employee twice a year on safety, teaching everyone where the emergency shutoff is for equipment, and how to do eye wash. By the way, did you know shutting down a machine at the breaker will often destroy $1 million piece of machinery? I didn't. I also made the company buy multiple eye wash stations and a first aid kit. I added fire extinguishers suitable for the area and had them serviced every year. Anyway, some idiot calculated how much money that meeting cost the company, and those safety meetings stopped. The owner refused to allow me to paint danger zones on the floor around the machines, operator only and safe walk areas. Nope, he put a stop to all of it. Afterward, I saw one of the salespeople on a ladder in the warehouse in flip-flops. Oh, and half the staff got COVID. People working in factories lose fingers more often than you'd think. Story 8. Working at a call center, I was in the break area on the second floor and heard a guy getting into an argument with his soon-to-be ex-wife. I walked away and back into my call area, and about 30 seconds later the whole call center went into lockdown. Found out that the guy decided to unalive himself and jump headfirst into the concrete floor and landed right in front of my coworker. He was granted unlimited paid days off and paid therapy for the rest of the year. Something similar happened at my call center job. Really big name in insurance in the US. This happened maybe 4 to 5 years ago. This guy was on his personal phone, then got into an argument with whoever he was talking to and decided to jump off the balcony inside the main building and fall 5 stories. He was rushed to the hospital, but he died after that. My coworker and I went to the area the day after, and we could still see blood on the floor. It sounded like a car hit the building when he hit the floor. The worst part is, the company hardly acknowledged it. They didn't even release his name or provide counselors. Free therapy? Sign me up for a lifetime of trauma. Story 9. Opioid addiction patients would inject directly into open wounds in her bicep. And I'm not talking about small wounds. Both her biceps were eaten away. There were little thready bits of tissue that were inconvenient because they would get caught on stuff, so she cut them. She was in her mid-20s but had started using as a teenager with her mom. She would get bloodstream infections and heart infections and leave before finishing treatments. I was addicted to heroin for 15 years. Thankfully, I was trained as a phlebotomist, so while my veins didn't exactly survive my addiction well, I never experienced an abscess or any infections. 11 years later, I have some minor scarring and typically need ultrasound for blood draws, but I came out of it all right. For anyone who doesn't understand the value of needle exchange programs, which also teach safe injection practices and other harm reduction methods, as well as offer a pathway to recovery, seeing a patient in that kind of shape, I would hope would change their minds. Everyone deserves a chance to get better. This reminds me of the time I worked in a rehab/methadone clinic. We had an older lady who was addicted to heroin and would only come in later in the day to see the doctor. I vividly remember the first time she came in. The place quickly got a rotten, sweet smell, and when I asked the other staff what was up, they told me about her open, rotting wounds. After getting them cleaned up by the doctor and bandaged, she would trade her methadone for heroin and go home. At home, she would take off the bandages and shoot straight into the veins in the open wound. She would pass out on the dirty floor and get it all messed up again. Rinse, repeat for as long as I worked there. That was the first time I was met with sweet-smelling odor of human decay. I'll never forget that smell. This has got to be one of the toughest medical practices you can do. Story 10. I'm a nurse. Used to work on an oncology unit. One of my patient's family members walked into the wrong room by accident. The patient in that room had passed away and was shrouded, waiting for transport to the morgue. She threw herself on the body, weeping, thinking it was her loved one and no one had called her. Then we realized what happened. It was not good. My friend was telling me about his sibling-in-law's grandmother who donated her body to science. About 18 months after she died, they got a very respectful call saying they were finished with her, had cremated her remains as she had wished, and would send the ashes to the family. The family receives said ashes, interscatter them, and carries on. 12 months after that, they got another very respectful call saying they were finished with her, had cremated her remains as she wished, and would send the ashes to the family. Luckily, the family member who received the call just laughed at them and said, "Who the hell did we get the first time?" The second call turned out to have been an admin error. So a similar sad healthcare story, an elderly nursing home patient in her 90s with an amazing badass life story. She was among the first to catch COVID. Amazingly, she survived, though mentally she deteriorated. Because she survived this, each new COVID patient became her roommate. 6 deaths in a row. On number 6, they misidentified the body as her. The family couldn't visit before a vaccine existed. The family was falsely notified of her death. Roughly a week later, the funeral director figured it out and he notified the family that she was in fact not dead. The nursing home never apologized. They pulled her out. That's the most ridiculous misunderstanding I've ever heard of. Story 11. Craned an old grain bin that was cemented into the concrete slab it was on. The bird poop, feathers, and carcasses made a firm floor about 2 feet deep. Inside were about 15 pigeons who looked like they had never seen the light of day. Some were too messed up to fly or too young. One was pink, like bald, and absolutely the offspring of multi-generational incest. They were all messed up. They couldn't get out because the only place to escape was the cap at the top, which is impossible for a bird to fly vertically through without messing up their flight on the roof sheets. I'm guessing they survived off the grain left inside it and cannibalized the dead. Most farmers, in my experience, air out the bins and leave ways for birds to escape before we show up to do work. But that was probably the nastiest farmyard I've been in. There were 7 other bins just like it in a row. I don't know about you, but I did not expect to hear a story about a bunch of isolated inbred pigeons today. Story 12. Worked with a guy at a retail store. He came in one day with one red eye and the other normal, so I asked if he was okay. He said yes and said his pet rabbit scratched him while he was playing with it. I didn't think anything of it until about 3 days later when he got arrested and charged with the murder of a pregnant woman and her fetus. He partly dismembered her body to try and hide his tracks, and when he realized that wouldn't work, he then burned her house down with the body inside. That's when I realized that those scratches were really from her fighting for her life. His name is Matthew Brush, and as far as I know, he's still in prison. You never really know how many murderers you've come across in your life. Story 13. I worked at a company of about 28 people where 1. Partner 1 died in our largest client's corporate jet crash. 2. 10 months later, Partner 2 and President was caught by his wife canoodling an account executive, checked into a hotel with a pint of Rocky Road ice cream, a bottle of champagne, and a snub-nosed .38 and did the predictable thing. In truth, it was one of 4 different affairs in an office of 28 people. That meant more than one person in every 3 was banging one another. By the way, I wasn't one of them. 3. Partner number 3 came out of 6 months of rehab to take over the helm of the shop. True to form for people who go through rehab, he thought everybody should go through a 12-step program. So he bussed all of us up to a mountaintop in the middle of January to talk about our feelings and do trust exercises. 4. After that, he started firing employees who had manned their posts while he was in rehab. I wasn't one of them, but I certainly didn't trust him with my career, all in 2 years. At this point, this office needs an exorcist. Story 14. A guy cut his forearm open with a paint chip from the wall and then played with his tendons like they were guitar strings. Meanwhile, blood was spraying all over the cell. I'm a corrections officer. One of my friends used to be a CO in a Gen Pop pod and then the mental health unit. He has some wild stories. One inmate would ask the time, then drop and start doing push-ups and ask him to let him know when an X amount of time has passed. He said he would go back an hour or so later, and as far as he could tell, this inmate never stopped pushing. He got put in medical for rhabdomyolysis a few times. Another time, an inmate tried to shank him, so he threw him down the stairs without him hitting a single step. Another guy had ripped open his scrotum and was playing with his testicles. Yet another liked to sound himself with pens, but pushed it in too far and it got stuck. They took him to medical, held his feet up by his head. The doc put on a long glove, dipped it in lube, and shoved it up the inmate's behind and popped the pen back out. The nastiest one, to me anyway, was an inmate who got gang on. Later, he was on the toilet in his cell when my buddy walked by and he asked for help. Buddy told him to come to the door and cuff up, and the guy wouldn't get off the toilet. Buddy says F it, it's near the end of his shift and he's not gonna deal with an extraction, and walks away. The next day he makes his rounds and the dude is still on the crapper. He asks him if he's moved, but the inmate says no and is still asking for help. They get a team together and go in. Dude is non-combative. Turns out he had to stuff and prolapsed his rectum and sat there all night with it hanging out. These were the standouts. The rest were your run-of-the-mill bodily fluids, excrement, and cell extraction fights. Can't say how much was embellishment, but it made for some good stories. I did not need to hear those details. Story 15. I worked at one of the busiest Walmarts in the country doing spring break for 6 years. I wouldn't even know where to begin. I guess the drunk lady left the bathroom with her pants around her ankles while actively crapping as she walks across the front of the building and back outside into the wild. None of the workers wanted to deal with it, so they parked a shopping cart over each turd until the cleaning crew came in. I didn't see the person do it, but discovered the evidence. They had somehow managed to walk around an entire display of bread and a few laps of the bakery area and shat the entire time. This wasn't human, I swear. It was horrible. Boss instructed me to clean it up. I said not without a full hazmat suit, mask, gloves, and a freaking shower after. He went out and got me the things and said, once you're done, go home. By this point, I finished in an hour. I hated that dude. At this point, quitting would have been preferable. Story 16. Worked in search and rescue almost 10 years ago. We entered a building in an area that had been recently shelled quite heavily, and it was in rough shape. The apartments on the lower levels had been completely shredded, and while the upstairs apartments looked okay on the inside, there were huge cracks in the walls and floors of the building, and everything you touched or stepped on erupted in a cloud of dust. Power was out. Plumbing was shot to crap with leaks all over the place, and the people inside needed to relocate somewhere else. We could hear screaming from I think the 3rd floor, but as we moved upward, it was getting fainter and fainter, gradually reducing into a kind of wailing or sobbing sound. We eventually find the apartment it's coming from, and on the other side of the door is a kid, maybe 6 or 7 years old, crouched under a table, hands over his ears. There's blood everywhere. It's on the floors, all over the tabletop. There are arcs of it spattered up on the walls. We had no idea what to expect. Then we went around the corner into the kitchen and found the mother. She was slumped on the floor, still weakly sobbing with both of her hands amputated on the floor next to her. She was trying to clutch her bleeding stumps in some bed sheets and an old towel. Her injuries were nothing to do with the direct exposure to the conflict. Her husband had allegedly caught her with evidence of infidelity, severed both of her hands in rage, and then fled the scene. He had been radicalized into local extremist groups, and as soon as the situation in the city turned ugly, he left her there to die. I hope he got worse than she did in the end. Do you know what happened to her? Did she survive getting her hands amputated? She survived. Unfortunately, they were unable to reattach either hand as it had been too long and they were contaminated by the time suitable medical aid was available. An aid worker from a charity group that we liaised with occasionally took on her case personally and helped put her in touch with rehabilitation specialists, and I believe helped with access to prosthesis. The last update I had was probably around 2 years ago. The son, who was also in the apartment that day, goes to a technical school now and wants to be a mechanic. This guy is a hero. Story 17. I worked at a vet's office as a veterinary technician. We worked in a lower privileged area, and unfortunately that meant a lot of the animals we saw were not taken care of as they should have been, whether intentionally or not. But there was one dog who was not older than 2 years, but she looked like a senior dog of 15 plus years with the amount of damage. This poor dog had been declawed, but it was a nightmare of a mess. She clearly had pains when she walked. She was missing an eye. The owner said she got a stick in her eye. Fat bull in my opinion. Her neck had clear signs of long-term being chained too tight. Red welts. Anyway, none of those things were the main problem. The owner was a middle-aged man who looked like he couldn't give a crap about his dog, but he said the dog barked all the time and smelled terrible, so his wife made him bring it. We took the dog back, and he was right. It smelled god-awful. We noticed an oozing spot on her shoulder, so we ended up shaving the dog, and her entire side was completely covered in red infected skin. The pain that poor dog must have felt would have been unimaginable. We found she had been shot with buckshot that had gotten infected and spread to her entire skin. We knew she was beyond help. The owner didn't want to pay for it and said he would take care of it at home. I then heard him on the phone in the other room saying he was going to take the dog and use it as hunting practice. What a disgusting human being. I told my veterinarian, who was already horrified and wanting to call animal control. Anyways, we pretended the dog died and he left, and we knew the poor thing was beyond help. So we have her food and pain medication and put her to sleep. Rest easy, puppy. I don't really have any words for this one. It's just a horrifying thing to hear. Story 18. Used to work at a regional coffee shop in the Midwest. I won't say which, and we had been seeing a few cockroaches around, and management called in exterminators. On a hunch, something to do with cockroaches' innate love for heat. The guy lifts open the espresso machine and finds not one, not two, not three, a whole colony of cockroaches ecosysteming it up right in the machinery. That was 2 years into my college job as a barista there, and I had a latte every day. I can't imagine how that coffee machine smelled. Story 19. 2 incidents at 2 different Walmart grocery distribution centers. The first I got to work when they were wheeling out an inventory control coworker of mine to an ambulance with blood everywhere. She had a forklift operator run through an intersection on the dry grocery side forks first and speared her leg with a fork up against the rack. She nearly died on the way to the hospital. The second was a banana room door that came down fast for the lifts to go through or for an employee to walk in. Came down and sliced the nose off a quality control employee, resulting in an investigation that showed the doors company-wide were installed incorrectly. The worst thing I heard about was at the West Point plant in Chipley, Florida. An employee had her arm ripped up in a comforter machine. Well, that wasn't very comforting. Story 20. I was sorting all the psych patients that were hospitalized in my state and got to this guy, a teenager or maybe a bit older, and he got sent to the ward because he suddenly got aggressive and started to have some episodes where he squirmed in pain, took off his clothes and things like that. Before being hospitalized, he was complaining about these things, but nothing the medics did was working and nothing was found. So it should be a psychiatric issue, no? Wrong. He was put in the ward for 2 or so years and lost a lot of his life, being considered insane, because he developed a rare spinal cancer that was hard to detect and caused him extreme pain. Really messed up. I don't remember what happened to him afterward, but I'm not really optimistic that it had a happy ending. That sounds absolutely horrible. How can healthcare providers let you do that? Story 21. Doing retail, and this woman tried to rope all of us working at the counter into shaming her son, or husband, because he came up and asked about our store hours. This went on for 10 minutes and we're basically begging her to go away, and the guy looks like a whipped dog. So uncomfortable and gross. Don't even know why she was mad about it. She just kept yelling that she already told him not to ask, and that she wanted him to apologize to all of us for wasting our time. We kept telling her it was fine. We were here to answer questions, and then she'd get even more angry and insist that we had to be angry with him as well, or how would he ever learn? The whole thing was bizarre. It seems like there were some nefarious reasons behind the apology. Story 22. Worked at White Castle. My manager gave me edibles, so I decided to take them on my break. They were small gummies, so I thought it was not much and took the whole bag. Again, very small. In about 10 minutes I felt them kicking in, which was kind of fast, so I asked her how many milligrams. According to her, 1,000 milligrams. When I showed her the empty bag, her jaw dropped all the way down. She was like, yeah, no, I'ma have you work in the back for the rest of the shift. I was so messed up I could not tell between my imagination and reality, but I tell you, I cleaned the heck out of that place. I honestly had a near psychedelic state. It was astronomical. I don't remember much, but damn, I remember the feeling I had. Oh, my bad. I thought this was supposed to be about the most messed up you've been at work. Okay, I needed that laugh after all of this seriousness. Story 23. I worked at a Goodwill for a few years. We had a lot of drug addicts trying to shoot up in the changing room and had an occasional OD. But the most shocking thing I experienced was the number of times people physically threatened or attacked me or my coworkers when we refused their donations, getting in our faces and trying to push us around. One guy tried to hit someone with a car. Another one threw a picture frame that narrowly missed smashing my supervisor's head. Another threw such a temper tantrum that he smashed an entire set of chairs and a kitchen table. There was also someone who called the police because we changed the prices of softcover books. Changing the prices? Off to jail. Story 24. Once witnessed a group of 15 to 16-year-old teenagers steal an older man's wallet in the mall. They ran past the coffee shop I worked in and went up the escalator, closely followed by the man. Next thing I knew, I heard screaming and fighting and smelled metal, which turned out to be a ton of blood. Turns out the man got into a fight with them and then got stabbed. That entire half of the mall got shut down by the police, and the smell lingered for the rest of that day. I feel terrible for the old man. Story 25. Worked with ski lifts for a while. One morning, we were clearing out the pit, place where the chairlift maneuvers before no man's land, place between the pit and where the lift goes up, and one crew member wasn't paying attention and got bonked on the head by a 400-pound chair accelerating to about 450 feet per minute. Thankfully, the ski patrol was there when it happened. 450 feet per minute. Damn, can't imagine how hard that must have hit him. Story 26. Nothing huge, as I've only ever worked in a grocery store up until I was disabled. A girl had a seizure, as she would many times after, and I was one of the very few who would ever react quickly. Once, I think the 4th time, I turned her on her side and put her head on a pillow, one I had bought and left at work for this specific issue, and she barfed all over it and my leg. While I stank for a bit, that was an hour of paid time they let me have to go home, shower, and get some new clothes, so thanks, April. I needed a break that day. At least OP got to go home. Story 27. Not exactly as crazy as some of these, but I worked at a very large bank. This very nice old lady had been in the hospital after breaking her hip and then battling an infection from that injury. During that time, her bills that were on autopay overdrafted her account several times until the autopay is canceled. As you might imagine, there were overdraft fees, but each overdraft fee, $35, also triggers another overdraft fee, plus $35, and then that fee triggers what's called an extended overdraft fee, plus $35. When she finally called, she got me on the phone. She had over $635 in overdraft fees on top of a negative balance of the bills that had overdrawn her account. I'll call her Grace. Grace was a retired teacher of 45 years. She had an account with the bank for over 50 years. Grace had a very small lifetime savings of just over $100K and a small monthly pension from her deceased husband. She was basically pleading on the phone for us to help her. She promised to cover the negative balance but asked that we waive the overdraft fees. I was 100% invested in helping her. I attempted to refund as many of the fees as I could, but I was limited to only about $200 of the fees. I went to my manager, who had more authority, with the same story. The first question out of his mouth was something they always asked: how much money does she have with us? As if someone who didn't have much money didn't deserve a fee refund as much as someone who had millions. Just over $100K, I said. He sighed, looked over the account, and then said, I don't see us waiving any more fees. But sir, she had her accounts with us for over 50 years. The manager just sends the request up to our unit manager. She comes back declining the fees. Why? Household balance does not support fee refund. I'm livid, so I got back on the phone and told Grace that if she covers the entire negative balance, including the remaining fees, to avoid more overdraft fees, then I will work on getting her money back. I worked with another conspiring coworker to use our new monthly fee quotas to refund more fees for Grace until we managed to refund them all. When I called her back, she was elated, thanked me profusely for helping her through her struggle. Several weeks later, my coworker and I were walked into a meeting room by security. We were fired for attendance violations, which we accumulated for being 3 minutes late from break or lunch, all of which started only a few days after we helped Grace. I am very punctual and know for a fact that those time entries were manipulated by my manager, but there was zero recourse for me. The best part is that I got hired at another financial institution that actually loved my story of helping Grace because they actually give a crap about their customers. At least one of these stories today restored my faith in humanity. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story that you'd like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.